I had never seen Bob Hope like that. Not on stage, not on TV, and certainly not in the quiet moments between the laughter. It was Christmas Eve. I was in Da Nang, Vietnam, covering what would become the bloodiest year of the war. The monsoon rains had turned the airstrip into a sea of red mud, and the sound of distant artillery rolled across the hills like thunder that never stopped. I'd been embedded with the Marines for 3 weeks, watching boys who should have been opening presents under Christmas trees back home, instead writing letters they hoped wouldn't be their last. The USO had flown in for their annual show, Bob Hope's traveling circus of starlets and songs, bringing a few hours of home to men who'd forgotten what laughter sounded like. But what I witnessed backstage that night in a leaking Quonset hut lit by a single bare bulb showed me something about fame, duty, and the weight of making other people smile that I've never forgotten. And it started with Bob Hope, alone, crying into his hands like a man who'd just lost everything. Let me take you back to understand how I ended up there. By 1966, I'd been covering the Vietnam conflict for CBS News for over 2 years. I'd seen the early optimism of American advisors give way to the grim reality of a war that couldn't be won with conventional thinking. I'd stood in rice paddies under hostile fire, sat with generals who publicly proclaimed victory while privately expressing doubt, and interviewed young soldiers who asked me to explain to them and to America what exactly they were dying for. But Christmas in a war zone is different. There's something particularly cruel about it. The contrast between what should be, families gathered, children laughing, the comfort of tradition, and what is mud, fear, the constant possibility of death, creates a kind of emotional whiplash that affects even the most hardened correspondent. I'd planned to do a piece on how our servicemen celebrated the holidays so far from home, trying to find some thread of hope to bring back to a nation that was increasingly divided about this war. That's when I learned Bob Hope was coming. Now you have to understand what Bob Hope meant to the American military. This wasn't just a celebrity making an appearance. Since World War II, Hope had been the unofficial ambassador of American entertainment to troops overseas. Every Christmas, without fail, he packed up a show. Beautiful actresses, musicians, comedians, and flew to wherever American servicemen were stationed. Korea, Germany, Greenland. And now Vietnam, year after year, even as the war grew more unpopular, even as other entertainers refused to go, even as the danger increased. I'd met Hope a few times before, always briefly, always in that whirlwind of publicity and performance that surrounded him. He was exactly what you'd expect, quick with a joke, that ski slope nose, that perfectly timed delivery that could make you laugh at a punchline you saw coming from a mile away. He moved through crowds like a man who'd never met a stranger, shaking hands, signing autographs, always on in that way that professional entertainers are. I'd admired his dedication, certainly, but I'd never thought much about the man beneath the persona. That changed on Christmas Eve. The show was scheduled for the afternoon, a makeshift stage constructed from wooden pallets, sound equipment that had been helicopter lifted in, and a crowd of about 5,000 Marines, soldiers, and airmen who'd been given a few hours reprieve from the war. I arrived early to scout locations for filming, walking through the backstage area that consisted of a few metal huts connected by wooden walkways covered in canvas to keep out the rain. The energy was electric. Joey Heatherton was rehearsing a dance number, her sequin dress somehow still glamorous despite the mud and humidity. Les Brown and his band of renown were tuning instruments, sound checking against the backdrop of helicopters taking off and landing. Anita Bryant was warming up her voice. Everyone was in high spirits, that particular kind of focused excitement that comes before a big show. Everyone except Bob Hope. I found him by accident. I'd taken a wrong turn looking for the latrine and ended up at a hut at the far end of the compound. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see him sitting on a metal folding chair, still in his civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a polo shirt, his famous golf cap sitting on a trunk beside him. His head was in his hands and his shoulders were shaking. Now you have to understand what Bob Hope meant to the American military. This wasn't just a celebrity making an appearance. Since World War II, Hope had been the unofficial ambassador of American entertainment to troops overseas. Every Christmas, without fail, he packed up a show, beautiful actresses, musicians, comedians, and flew to wherever American servicemen were stationed. Korea, Germany, Greenland, and now Vietnam, year after year, even as the war grew more unpopular, even as other entertainers refused to go, even as the danger increased. I'd met Hope a few times before, always briefly, always in that whirlwind of publicity and performance that surrounded him. He was exactly what you'd expect, quick with a joke, that ski slope nose, that perfectly timed delivery that could make you laugh at a punchline you saw coming from a mile away. He moved through crowds like a man who'd never met a stranger, shaking hands, signing autographs, always on in that way that professional entertainers are. I'd admired his dedication, certainly, but I'd never thought much about the man beneath the persona. That changed on Christmas Eve. The show was scheduled for the afternoon, a makeshift stage constructed from wooden pallets, sound equipment that had been helicopter lifted in, and a crowd of about 5,000 Marines, soldiers, and airmen who'd been given a few hours reprieve from the war. I arrived early to scout locations for filming, walking through the backstage area that consisted of a few metal huts connected by wooden walkways covered in canvas to keep out the rain. The energy was electric. Joey Heatherton was rehearsing a dance number, her sequin dress somehow still glamorous despite the mud and humidity. Les Brown and his band of renown were tuning instruments, sound checking against the backdrop of helicopters taking off and landing. Anita Bryant was warming up her voice. Everyone was in high spirits, that particular kind of focused excitement that comes before a big show. Everyone except Bob Hope. I found him by accident. I'd taken a wrong turn looking for the latrine and ended up at a hut at the far end of the compound. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see him sitting on a metal folding chair, still in his civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a polo shirt, his famous golf cap sitting on a trunk beside him. His head was in his hands and his shoulders were shaking. At first I thought he might be laughing. Hope was famous for his warm-up routines, for working through material, for cracking himself up with his own jokes. But as I stood there, frozen, not wanting to intrude but unable to look away, I realized he was crying. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere profound and painful. I should have left. A journalist's instinct wars with human decency in moments like that, and decency should always win. But before I could move, he looked up, saw me standing there, and our eyes met. "Jesus, Walter," he said, his voice thick and broken. "I'm sorry, I didn't come in. Please, close the door." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The hut was sparse, a cot, a trunk, a small table with a mirror and stage makeup. Rain drummed on the metal roof. Somewhere outside, someone was playing White Christmas on a crackling radio. I shouldn't have seen that. I said quietly, "I can go." "No." He wiped his face with both hands, then looked at me with red-rimmed eyes that seemed suddenly ancient. "Maybe it's good you're here. Maybe someone should see this. Someone should know." He stood up, walked to the small window, and stared out at the rain. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of all the performance, all the practiced timing, all the carefully constructed persona that America knew and loved. "I met a kid this morning," he began, EFC Danny Morrison, 19 years old, from Bakersfield, California. He'd been hit by shrapnel 3 days ago, lost his right leg below the knee. They'd stabilized him enough that he could be moved, and he heard I was coming, and he begged the doctors to let him stay one more day so we could see the show. Hope turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I'd seen before on the faces of men who'd carried too much for too long. He asked me to tell him a joke, Hope continued, said he hadn't laughed in 6 months, said he needed to remember what it felt like. So I did my whole routine for him, just him, in that hospital tent, every joke I could remember. And he laughed, Walter. God, he laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. And when I was done, he grabbed my hand and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hope. Thank you for making me feel normal again, even if it was just for a few minutes." His voice cracked and he had to stop, had to gather himself, and all I could think was, I'm going out there in an hour to tell jokes to 5,000 kids just like him. Kids who are going to go right back to dying in rice paddies and jungles for a war that half of America doesn't even support anymore. And what good are my jokes? What good is any of this? I'd covered enough war to understand the question. It's the question that haunts everyone who bears witness to suffering without being able to stop it. Journalists, doctors, chaplains, we all face it. But I'd never thought about what it meant for an entertainer, for someone whose entire purpose was to bring joy to people in circumstances that were joyless. "You want to know the truth, Walter?" he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "I'm terrified every time I do this. I'm terrified that this will be the year when the jokes don't work, when the laughter doesn't come, when I'll stand on that stage and realize that what I do, making people laugh, is meaningless in the face of what these boys are going through." He sat back down heavily, and I pulled up another folding chair sitting across from him. The rain kept falling. Outside, I could hear the show crew calling to each other, making final preparations. "Why do you keep doing it?" I asked. He looked at me like I'd asked the most profound question in the world. "Because I don't know what else to do," he said simply. "Because if I don't come, if I don't stand on that stage and make them laugh, even for just an hour, then I'm just another person back home who doesn't think about them, who doesn't care enough to show up. At least this way they know somebody gives a damn." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a letter I could see, written in careful handwriting on cheap stationery. "I get hundreds of letters," he said, smoothing the paper on his knee. "Most of them thank me. Tell me the show meant something. But I keep this one because it tells me the truth. He handed it to me, and I read it. It was from a Marine sergeant who'd seen Hope's show in 19... The letter thanked Hope for coming, but then said something that struck me. "Mr. Hope, you made us laugh, and that was good. But what meant more was that you came at all, that you left your mansion in California, and your golf courses, and your comfortable life to stand in the mud with us. That told us we weren't forgotten. That's what I'll remember." I handed the letter back, and Hope carefully folded it and returned it to his pocket. "That's what I hold on to," he said. "Not the laughter necessarily, the showing up. But today, after meeting Danny Morrison, after seeing what he lost and knowing he's one of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands before this is over, I just don't know if showing up is enough anymore." We sat in silence for a while. Outside, I could hear the crowd gathering, the excited murmur of thousands of young men about to see something that wasn't war, if only for an afternoon. "Can I tell you something, Bob? Something I've learned covering this war?" He nodded. "Nothing is enough," I said. "My reporting isn't enough to stop the dying. The doctors can't save everyone. The chaplains can't comfort every soul. Nothing any of us do is enough measured against the scale of the suffering. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Those boys out there, they're not asking you to end the war. They're not asking you to make sense of it. They're asking you to remind them that there's still something worth fighting for, that there's still beauty and laughter and humanity somewhere in the world. And for 1 hour, you're going to give them that. Is it enough? No. Does it matter? More than you know." Hope was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Then he stood up, walked to the mirror, and began applying his stage makeup with practiced efficiency. I watched the transformation, the vulnerable man being carefully tucked away behind the persona, the fear being covered by confidence, the tears being replaced by the twinkle-eyed comedian America expected to see. But there was a difference now. I could see it in his eyes. The performance was still there, but underneath it was something rawer, something more honest. He was choosing to go on stage, choosing to be Bob Hope, not because it was easy or natural, or because he believed jokes could solve anything, but because it was what he could offer, and offering something was better than offering nothing. "How do I look?" he asked, turning to face me with that famous Hope grin. "Like you're ready to give 5,000 kids the best Christmas they'll have this year," I said. He laughed, not his stage laugh, but something softer and more genuine. "Let's hope you're right, Walter. Let's hope you're right." I watched the show from the side of the stage. It was everything a Bob Hope USO show was supposed to be: polished, professional, filled with beautiful women and corny jokes and musical numbers that had men whistling and cheering. Hope was brilliant, hitting every mark, never missing a beat, making 5,000 battle-weary servicemen forget where they were for 60 precious minutes. But I kept watching his eyes. Between the jokes, in the brief moments when someone else was performing, I could see him scanning the crowd, looking for someone, and then I realized he was looking for PFC Danny Morrison. The kid who'd lost his leg was sitting in the front row, brought in on a stretcher, and every time Hope made the audience roar with laughter, his eyes would flick to that kid, checking to make sure he was laughing too. And he was. Danny Morrison was laughing like he'd never been hurt, like there was no war, like he was just a 19-year-old kid watching the most famous comedian in America do what he did best. After the show, I saw Hope make his way through the crowd, shaking hands, signing autographs, taking pictures. He spent hours doing this, long after the other performers had retreated to rest before the flight out. When he finally reached Danny Morrison, he knelt beside the stretcher, muddy ground be damned, and talked with him for 15 minutes. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw Danny laughing, saw him reach out and grip Hope's hand, saw Hope lean in and say something that made the kid's face light up with something that looked like joy or hope, or maybe just the simple comfort of being seen by someone who cared. I never did that piece on Christmas in Vietnam. Instead, I filed a story about Bob Hope's USO show, professional and respectful, focusing on the entertainment and the service. But I kept what I'd seen in that Quonset hut to myself. It felt private, sacred somehow. A glimpse behind the curtain that wasn't mine to share while both the war and Hope's career were still ongoing. But I've thought about it often over the years. After the war ended and the nation struggled to reconcile what we'd done and why. After Bob Hope became a polarizing figure to some, seen as too supportive of the military, too uncritical of the war itself. After he grew old and his style of comedy became dated and younger generations dismissed him as a relic. I've thought about it because I think we often misunderstand what courage looks like. We think of it as fearlessness, as charging forward without doubt. But real courage, the kind that matters, is doing what needs to be done, even when you're terrified it won't be enough. Even when you doubt whether it makes any difference, even when half the country thinks you're wrong for even trying. Bob Hope could have stayed home. He was rich, famous, beloved. He could have played golf in California and counted his money and lived a comfortable life. Instead, he spent nearly 30 years of his life getting on military transport planes and flying to war zones to tell jokes to kids who might die the next day. not because he thought jokes could stop wars, not because he believed he had all the answers, but because showing up mattered, because being there, standing in the mud with them, saying, I see you, I value you, you're not forgotten, that mattered. The last time I saw Bob Hope was in 19... He was older, slower, but still working, still performing. During a quiet moment, I approached him and mentioned that Christmas Eve in Da Nang. I half expected him not to remember. It had been nearly 20 years, and he'd done dozens of tours since then. But he remembered. His eyes got that faraway look, and he nodded slowly. Danny Morrison, he said quietly, I got a letter from his mother 2 years after that tour. He made it home, lost his leg, but he made it. She said he told everyone that the Bob Hope show was when he decided he was going to live, when he remembered that life could still be good, even with everything he'd lost. He paused, and for just a moment, I saw that same vulnerable man I'd encountered in the Quonset hut. One kid, Hope said, out of thousands, out of all those tours, all those shows, all those jokes, one kid whose life maybe I helped save. Is that enough? I still don't know, Walter, but it's something. It has to be something. It was something, Bob. It was more than something. Bob Hope died in 2003 at the age of 100, and the world remembered him as an entertainment legend, a patriot, an icon of 20th century American culture. All of that was true. But what I'll always remember is the man who cried in a Quonset hut on Christmas Eve because he understood the weight of making people laugh when they had so little to laugh about. The man who doubted whether his gifts were enough but gave them anyway. The man who showed up year after year because showing up was what he could do, and doing what you can, even when it feels insufficient, is the definition of character. We live in an age that's quick to judge, quick to demand perfection, quick to dismiss people who don't meet every ideal we've constructed for them. But I learned something important watching Bob Hope in Vietnam, that people are complex, that good people can have doubts and fears and still do meaningful work, and that sometimes the most courageous act is simply refusing to give up on trying to bring light into dark places. I never saw Bob Hope like that again, not in public, not in private. But I carried that moment with me, and I share it now because I think we need to remember that our heroes are human, that their strength comes not from having all the answers, but from continuing to ask the right questions, that showing up matters, that trying matters, that offering what you can, even when you're terrified it won't be enough, is what separates those who make a difference from those who merely watch from comfort and safety. Bob Hope showed up for 30 years, through multiple wars, through doubt and fear and criticism. He showed up. And to those thousands of young Americans in uniform who saw him, who laughed at his jokes, who shook his hand, who felt seen and valued and remembered, that meant everything. That's the Bob Hope I knew, not just the legend, the man. And that's the way it was.